but it was a little bit shocking that he came out so strong.
I wasn't at all shocked, to tell you the truth. I'm surprised nobody said it until now. People are politically correct, and they want to walk a tightrope and don't want to offend anybody. And this is all fine and good. When people are dying, it's a different story.
You definitely have to be very careful with it, but it's very hard for you to pinpoint that Moshe died because Reuven wasn't wearing a mask. That's a very, very scary statement to make, and it's not scientifically proven. It can't be proven. It's theory. It's theory. It's suspicion, but it's not proven at all, because nothing changes the facts. Science says that the particles that we're inhaling and exhaling are much, much, much smaller than the particles that the mask will filter out. So there's one glaring scientific question that anytime I ask it, all I get answered is everyone said, but nobody wants to deal with the actual
the odds are minimized, okay,
by maybe 5%. By maybe 5%. Maybe
I don't know if you could prove that.
You could quantify. You could quantify it, because if you have a particle that's 1/10 of the size of the hole in the mask, for sure, not more than 5% will be minimized. So I'm not saying there's no value in minimizing it. There's a huge value in minimizing it. And when you're playing with someone's life, I would much rather have 100% chance of survival than 95% of survival. And therefore, you should wear masks, no question about it. But to say that since he didn't wear a mask, he killed somebody, that's the statement that I felt went over the line. So no one's arguing you shouldn't wear a mask, because even 5% is very worthwhile, a 5% increase. But it's definitely not a 70% increase. That's false. That's fake science, because the fact is the particles are 1/10 of the size of the hole. That's a fact. That's not my fact. That's the government websites will tell you that. Unless you're wearing an N95 mask.
The 5% and 70% that you're talking about, the government says that?
Yeah, I went to government websites and I got the data, and they tell you that the aerosols are approximately, the biggest size aerosols are approximately 1.5 to 2 microns, and the holes in the masks, and the standard surgical masks, are substantially larger than those. Substantially larger. So that means it's going to filter out at most a fraction of it. So no one's saying you shouldn't wear a mask, but to cross the line and to say someone who didn't wear a mask is considered a murderer, that's a very, very strong statement to make. And I don't think most people would make such a statement. I don't even think the government would make such a statement, because it's not true. But I understand his position. He's speaking from passion. He's speaking as a Rav who's dealt with so much tragedy and so much sadness that he's crying out, and I understand that. I'm glad that you and I can have a normal, rational a conversation about it. But in his shul, after that speech, I can hear people screaming at each other, "You're a murderer! You're a murderer!" And that's where it becomes a little bit scary.
And that possibility exists. Okay, so
yeah,
nobody could say,
but there's
nobody could say that he didn't murder him either. Okay, and
that's right. But how come he's not talking about people who
sit next to each other, and one is wearing, and one is, and I don't know, the one got it and the other one didn't, and the one that didn't get it suddenly, I don't know. It just
no one's saying people shouldn't wear masks. Nobody's saying that. But the question is, are you allowed to refer to somebody who doesn't wear a mask as a murderer? That's the question.
Yeah, Dave, look at the numbers. Good morning, Sakiva. To call somebody a murderer, you might get it, and even if you might get it, is it fatal? It's the remote.
Well, you know what? Even the people that don't die, many of them are left scarred for life, with all sorts of medical issues.
Okay,
But it's still, but to call somebody a murderer is big. I mean, when do we reserve that? We reserve that for lashon hara and for what? Leisamet al dam re'echa, serious murder.
someone who takes the last piece of kugel out of Kiddush.
No, it's a mazik. It's big to be able to paint somebody as that. And I think what happens is because it's hyped up, people don't take it as seriously. That's I don't know about Yossi.
What he's
science.
saying is this, that the people who are in public not wearing masks, there's a possibility that they would be murdering somebody. That's what he's saying. That's his position. And nobody cannot deny that.
That's not what he said. He said this person died because this person sitting next to him didn't wear a mask. He didn't say it's possible.
I think you're being a little too literal there. Okay.
I'm just saying that those are the words that he said. Those are the words that he said. He said,
okay,
this he died because someone sat there without a mask. That's what he said. And he has to be very careful.
And I'm sure that happened. And I'm sure that has happened. Okay.
Okay, so let's see the Gemara. See, at least we can have a normal conversation about it. I'm sure there are places where people are screaming and cursing at each other, which is very dangerous. No, rather than
I'm very surprised. Yossi, I'm just very surprised. Dave Zolti is known for taking things in literal pshat. And now he's doing drush.
Pantu speaking. You I never take literally, Akiva.
Okay. So let's see the Halakha Gemara. We had a machlokes yesterday. What to learn out of the word mishras that's stated by Nazir, and the shaila is: do we learn from mishras that Thomas Keikar, and we export that l'chol Torah kula, which is what Rabbanan did, or do we say that mishras is used to teach us this new chiddush, according to Rabbi Kiva, the new chiddush of heter mitzaref le'iser, which is a much bigger chiddush than tam keikar. So the shaila is as follows. Amalei Rab Acha b'Reder Rab Abel Rabashi. Midir Rabbanan, of the fact that the Rabbanan use the mishras by Nazir to teach us tam keikar and then export it to Chol Torah Kula and use that as the source, the Chol Torah Kula, the tam is keikar. Nishma Rabbi Kiva, we should also take the same approach according to Rabbi Kiva, who learns from Mishras that heter mitzaref leitzer. Miloi amrinon, did we not say, Miloi ami rabbanon, Mishras litein tam keikar, mikanat adon l'chol yisurin sheb'Torah. According to the Rabbanon, we did export this chiddush of tam keikar that we learned by Nazir l'chol Torah kula. So the Rabbi Kiva nami, Mishras leheter mitzaref le'iser mikanat adon l'chol yisurin sheb'Torah kula. The same way the Rabbanon shares from Nazir l'chol Torah kula, why doesn't Rabbi Kiva do the same thing? Omar lei. So the Gemara answers. So Rabbi Ashi answered back. Mishum dav Nazir the chatos. According to Rabbi Kiva, Nazir, which has the chiddush of heter mitzaref le'iser, the chatos and chatos, which we're going to learn about, will also have that same chiddush. Shnei ksuvim abon kechod ve'en melamdin. We have a halacha of a binyan. The Torah will teach us a halacha by one inyan, and we're expected to apply that l'chol Torah kula unless there's a good reason not to. Now, if the Torah went out of its way to teach us the same halacha in two different places, it must be that the Torah is telling us a signal. The Torah is signaling to us. I really could have learned A out of B. Yet I specifically said that by A and by B, that's because I want you to apply it exclusively to A and to B and not to everything else. So since Nazir and Chatos repeated the same halacha, when really we could have learned one from the next, it's a sign to us that we should not teach this l'chol Torah kula. Nazir had amaram. Nazir was mishras, so that's how we learn, according to Rabbi Kiva, that heter mitzaref le'iser. Chatos mahi. Where do you see this concept by Chatos? The Tanya, because we looked in the Brisa. Kol asher yiga b'bsara yikdash. It says anything that touches the basar of chatos will become kodesh. It takes on the qualities of the chatos. Yochal afilu loy bala. You might think if they merely touch, but there's no exchange of fluids, there's no blias from one to the next, there would still be this halacha. So if two pieces of meat touch, one is, for instance, a chatos, one is chulin, and some juices exchange, there's blias, automatically yikdash liyais kamoya. The chulin now becomes exactly like the chatos. Shem psula he tifasal. If the chatos that it touched was puzzle and has to be burnt, it can't be eaten. Whatever touched it has to be burnt and it can't be eaten. Dim kesherihi. If it's kosher, then toichel kachamer shaba. So let's say we had a piece of carbon chatos touch a piece of carbon shlomim. The chatas could only be eaten today and tonight. The shlomim could be eaten today, tonight, and tomorrow. But now that the shlomim touched and had some absorption from the chatos, now the entire shlomim, even parts that has no impact, that was not impacted at all from the chatos, also is treated like a chatos. So you see, heter mitzaref le'isser, even part of this animal that had no connection whatsoever to the chatos, nevertheless, the whole piece of shlomim meat now is treated l'chumra like the carbon chatos, which means you would only be able to eat it today and tonight, and B, you would only be able to eat it in the azara, because a chatas may only be eaten in the azara, unlike a shlomim that can be eaten in all of Yerushalayim. On the flip side, sometimes the carbon chatas will be the kulidika one. For instance, let's say there's meat of a carbon shlomim that they were makriv yesterday. When does it time out? By the end of today, because shlomim gets 2 days and 1 night, which means by the end of today, you are no longer allowed to eat the meat of this shlomim. If this shlomim touched the chatos that you were makriv today, the chatos on its own would have been able to be eaten today and tonight. Now that it absorbed from the shlomim, we're going to limit its achila only to today, because we always have to treat it to chomer shaba. So you see two psukim, sai by nazir and sai by chatos, where the Torah tells us that heter is mitzaref l'isser, therefore we don't apply it anywhere else in the Torah. In fact, the more of our abona nami nav nazir the chatos shnei ksufim bam ka'echad ve'im. By according to the Rabbanon, that according to the Rabbanon who learns tam ke'ikr out of nazir, why don't you say nazir and chatos are also shnei ksufim abam ka'echad, and therefore tam ke'ikr should only apply by nazir, by chatos, but not anywhere else in the Torah. According to the Rabbanon, there's a reason for why the Torah told us it's halacha by chatos, and there's a reason why the Torah told us it's halacha by nazir, and we're going to get there in a minute. But we're going to come back to Rebbe Kiva now. Rebbe Kiva, my tzrichi. According to Rebbe Kiva, as we said, the halacha of heter mitzaref l'isser, which was stated in the Torah related to nazir and to chatos, they're not needed. And since they're not needed, in other words, we don't need to say it in both places, therefore we consider it shnei ksuvim abam ka'echad. So let's analyze to see if there is any reason to mention them both. And once we come to the conclusion that there was no reason to mention them both, then we could relax and say it's shnei ksuvim abam ka'echad. So Dr. Bishlama ikasav rachmana v'chatos lo gomer nazir minei. I would understand if the Torah only told us the halacha of heter mitzaref l'isser by chatos, I wouldn't know that that same chumrah applies to nazir as well. The chulin mikachim lo gomer. Chulin, we know, is less severe than kachim, and we don't learn chulin from kachim. And since we don't learn chulin from kachim, we definitely need the Torah to tell us this chumrah of heter mitzaref l'isser related to nazir. Ella lichtei v'rachmana b'nazir v'teisei chatos v'tigam rinei. Why did the Torah have to tell us this halacha of heter mitzaref l'isser by chatos? The Torah could have only told us this chiddush by nazir, and I would have known chatos, because chatos is a kachim which is even more chamer than nazir. Ta'akol yisurin sheb'Torah kagamar mi nazir. We learn all yisurim in the Torah from nazir because it's not considered kachim. Zok Gemara, Rabbanon Amri. So therefore, to conclude, since it could have only said it by Nazir, yet the Torah went out of its way to repeat this Chomer by Chatos, that's redundant. Once it's redundant, we have the concept of Shnei Ksuvim Abam Kechad Ve'im Malamdin. So Rabbi Akiva is going to limit this Chiddush of Heter Mitzaref L'Isser to two things only, to Chatos and to Nazir and nothing else. The Rabbanan Amrilach, the Rabbanan are going to tell you, Mitzrich Trichi, I need the pasuk of Mishras by Nazir, and I need the Chalash Yiga B'Vsara by Chatos, because I'm learning two different things out of them. Chatos is Laheter Mitzaref L'Isser. I agree with you, Rabbi Akiva, that there is the concept of Heter Mitzaref L'Isser. It just doesn't apply to Nazir. The Torah is not telling us that by Nazir. That the Torah is telling us by Chatos only. The Chulin Mikachim Legomer. And I can't learn Chulin from Kachim. Therefore, I will not apply this Chumrah of Heter Mitzaref L'Isser to Nazir. I would only apply it to Kachim. But I could learn Kachim from Kachim. Umishras Litin Tam Kiker. And Mishras by Nazir is not talking about Heter Mitzaref L'Isser. It's only teaching us the halacha of Tam Kiker. And therefore, it's not Shnei Kezuvim Abam Kechad. We cannot have done L'chol HaTorah Kula. So, if we analyze this, it's very interesting. Because up until this point, we assumed that Rabbi Akiva was the Machmer. Because Rabbi Akiva was the one who had this Isser that applies to Chatos and that applies to Nazir of Heter Mitzaref L'Isser. But now that we analyze it more closely, in fact, there are abundant of the Machmer. Because according to Rabbi Akiva, it's Shnei Ksubim Habam Ke'echad. Therefore, it only applies where the Torah specifically said it. And that's by Nazir and by Chatos, but by no other Kachim. According to the Rabbanon, it's not Shnei Ksubim Habam Ke'echad. The halacha of Heter Mitzaref L'Isser was said only by Chatos, but since it's not Shnei Ksubim Habam Ke'echad, I can apply it to all Kachim now. All Kachim will have this halacha because of a binyan. And Tam Ke'ikr, which I learned from Mishras, again, I can apply to L'chol HaTorah Kula, side to Kachim, and side to Chulu. Zok to Gemara of Rabbi Akiva, Tarvayu Leheter Mitzaref L'Isser, both the pasuk by Nazir as well as the pasuk by Chatos, we're applying to Heter Mitzaref L'Isser. So just to do the inventory at the end, according to the Rabbanon, the Mikor of Tam Kiker, L'chol HaTorah Kula, is Mishras, and it applies to L'chol HaTorah Kula. The Chiddush of Heter Mitzaref L'Isser is stated by Chatos, and it applies to all Kachim. And according to Rabbi Akiva, Mishras and Chatos are Shnei Ksuvim Habam Ke'echad, and we say that they have the Chumrah, and they only have the Chumrah of Heter Mitzaref L'Isser. And Tam Kiker, that we learn the L'chol HaTorah Kula, we learn from Geulin Achrim, we learn it from the fact that the Torah said that when you take Kalim from the Goyim, you have to kasher them. So that's how we know Tam Kiker L'chol HaTorah Kula. The Rabbanan said that wouldn't be a good Makor L'chol HaTorah Kula, because the fact that you have to kasher Kalim is in itself a Chiddush, because any taste that comes out of those Kalim would be nice and Tam Lufta. Omer Rabashi Rav Kahana, Elahad Tanya, if you're going to tell me this concept of Heter Mitzaref L'Isser, according to Rabbi Akiva, by Nazir, we have a brayso that says, Michol Asher Yaseh, Migefen Ayayin, Mechartzanim Vadzad. So the Torah teaches us from there, Limed al Yisurei Nazir, Shemistarfim Zem Zem. You don't have to have a kazayis of only seeds. You don't have to have a kazayis of flesh. You don't have to have a kazayis of skin. And we're talking about from the grape, of course. Rather, you can have a little bit of each, as long as combined between all of these three things, you've eaten a kazayis, you'll violate the Isser of Nazir. Why do we need a pasuk to tell us that you can combine different Isurim, different parts of the Isser Nazir to the kazayis? Hashtel Rabbi Akiva, Isser v'heter mitzarfen. I could even be mitzar of bread if I dipped it into the wine to the shear of the Isser. Isser v'Isser miboyi. Do I need the Torah to tell me that I could combine different Isurim, different parts of the grape? I could even combine bread. Omer lei. So Rav Kahana answered back, Isser v'heter b'lasachos. If you hold that heter mitzaref l'Isser, that means if you're eating it together, if you dip bread into wine, you eat it all together. That's when you know the chiyuv of heter mitzaref l'Isser. But iser ve'iser b'zeh chazeh. If I took a piece of bread and I ate it that had no wine in it, and then I drank some wine, nobody holds that would be mitzaref l'isur. But when it comes to these different types of grape parts, then I can have seeds by itself. Then I can have some grape skins by themselves. Then I can have some grape flesh by themselves. There will be mitzaref even b'zeh chazeh. So the chiddush of the different parts of the grapes being mitzaref is even b'zeh chazeh. The chiddush of heter mitzaref l'isur is only if they're being eaten together. Zok the heilige gemischte weiter. Botzeg shebesitke areva. What if you have some dough that's stuck into a crack inside a pot? Now, in those days, the dough wasn't left there because it wasn't properly cleaned. The dough was left there because it was actually filling a crack. They used it as a filler. So, im yesh kazayis b'makom echad. If there's a kazayis in one crack altogether, chayav levayer. Yeah, and become part of the bowl. Why wouldn't there be a problem with milk?
Let's say that dough was cooked with milk.
Then there would be a problem with milk. There would be a problem with milk. Yeah. So botok shebesit ke'areva im yesh kazayis b'makom echad. If you have a kazayis in one place, chayav levayer, you have a chayav of beer chametz on it. It's not bottle to the pot. It has a distinct identity as chametz. V'imloi, but if it's smaller than the kazayis, bottle b'miyuton. We'll say it's not chametz. It's bottled to the walls of the pot. V'chein le'inyan hatumah. And the same thing will be l'inyan tumah. You have a pot that became tummy, and you have to kasher it. Now, what I'm saying is just something to get us by until the Gemara analyzes what this means. And the Gemara is going to have 3 or 4 pshatim in what this means. But just to get by, if you have a pot that's tummy and you want to toivel it, and you have this dough inside it, is that dough a chatzitza? If you want to take that dough out, you don't want it there. Chaytitz, of course, it would be a chatzitza. But if you want it to stay there because it's being used as a repair patch to your pot, hareu kareva, we consider it part of the pot, and therefore, if you toivel it together, it will not be a chatzitza. Omer Rabbi Yehuda Mashmuel. Now, the Gemara is going to start off having 2 approaches as to how to understand our Mishnah. One is l'chumra, one is l'kula, and then the Gemara is going to end up saying that there's really no 2 approaches. There's really only one pshat. So we'll start off with the first pshat. Omer Rabbi Yehuda Mashmuel. Lo shanu ela b'makom shein asuyin l'chazik. This that we have a halacha that there might be a chatzitza or there might be a chiyuv to be mavayir the dough, that's only if the dough wasn't plugging a hole at the bottom of the pot, because there you might not want it to be part of the pot. If the dough is plugging a hole at the bottom of the pot, and without that dough you don't have a pot at all because your pot's leaking, then there would be no chiyuv to mavayir at all. So let's think about this. That tells me even if I have a kazayis of dough that's plugging a big hole at the bottom of the pot, there's no chiyuv beer, because since it's at the bottom of the pot, for sure it's bottled to the pot because we need it so that the pot shouldn't be considered broken. Michlal. So let's deduce from here the pachas mikazayis. If I had a piece of dough that was less than the kazayis, afilu b'mokim she'ein asu l'chazek ein chayv l'vayir. If I had a smaller piece of dough that was on the wall of the pot, I wouldn't have to be mevayired either. Because what does it say in the Mishnah? It's not talking about the bottom of the pot, because we just said the bottom of the pot, even if it's a kazayis, you don't have to be mevayired. It's speaking about on the side of the pot. And on that, the Brisa says, or the Mishnah as well, only if it's a kazayis. But if it's less than a kazayis, and it's at the side of the pot, it will be bottled to the pot. So in fact, we have 2 chidushim lakula that we just learned. A is a piece of dough that's bigger than the kazayis at the bottom of the pot is bottle. Kula number 1. Kula number 2, if it's at the side of the pot, if it's less than the kazayis, it's also bottle. So there are 2 kulas that this first approach takes on. There are those who learn it on the Seifa and then it would come out of Chumrah. When it says in the Seifa, the Mishnah, Vimlav, if it's less than a kazayis, only then batal b'miyutoi. On that, Amar Bidam Shmuel, lo yishanu ela b'makom asur l'chazek. When do we say that if it's less than a kazayis, it's batal? That's only if it's at the bottom of the pot. But if it's in the wall of the pot, chayiv levayir, even if it's less than a kazayis. Michalal, you see from here, the kazayis afilu b'makom asur l'chazek chayiv levayir. So there's two chumras here. A is that if it's a kazayis, no matter where it is, it's going to be a problem. And if it's less than the kazayis, it's going to be a problem in the wall of the pot. If it's less than the kazayis, it's only not a problem at the floor of the pot. But on the wall of the pot, even less than the kazayis is going to be a problem. So there's two chumras here. Tanya kalish nakama, Tanya kalish basar. We have a brisa that indicates that we understand it like the first motion, and we have a brisa that indicates like the second motion. Tanya kalish nakama, batzak shebesitkay areva, the makim asal chazik. Though that's in the crack of a pot, in the bottom of the pot, it's not a chatzitza, it's bottled to the pot. It will be chaytz. When do we say it's? When we say it's chaytz, when is it chaytz? Because ayis. So even if in the wall of the pot, it will only be a chatzitza. It will only be chiv to be mevayired if it's a kazayis. Even in the walls of the pot, over. So that's very clear, like the first nusach of Rabbi Yehuda Mashmul. The Tanya Kalish Basra. If you have dough in the crack of a pot, if it's in the floor of the pot, then it would not be chaytz. And you would not be over on chametz b'Pesach if it's on the floor of the pot. But if it's in the wall of the pot, chaytz will be chaytz. What type of chametz am I talking about, which is not chaytz at the bottom, but is chaytz on the wall? The pachas mikazayis. So even pachas mikazayis is going to be chaytz on the wall of the pot. Aval b'kazayis, if you had a larger piece, which was a kazayis or more, afilu b'makim ma'asel l'chazek chaytz, even if it was at the bottom of the pot, it'll be chaytz. So these are the two different approaches that we had. Again, to review, there's two shilas here. A, if it's in the bottom of the pot, will you be over if it's greater than the kazayis? According to the one lashon, if it's at the bottom of the pot, you're not over even though it's a kazayis. According to the other lashon, if it's at the bottom of the pot, if it's more than the kazayis, you're over. You're only not over if it's less than the kazayis. And then there was a shilah at the side of the pot. According to one lashon at the side of the pot, less than the kazayis is batal. And according to the other lashon, on the side of the pot, even less than the kazayis is also a problem. So we have two differences between the two lashonos. It's a stira. So it's really not a stira. You're allowed to have two brises that argue. Why would that be a problem? So the Gemara really means to say, since we have a brise alakula and a brise alachumra, what should we do? How should we paskin? Amrafuna same kilsa mekamechamerta. The first lashon was kuludik. Let's get rid of it. We need to go lachumra. Why? Because Pashat Sofik the Rice Lachumra is the Shaila of Chomet of Bayra Bayamasa. Kum Techais, Zok Tzlach. If we make Bittel Chomet, which we do, and now beer is only midrabanan, because there is no more Bal Yirah once you make Bittel Chomet. Therefore, you can go Lakula. If you make beer Chomet, then at the bottom of the pot, even if it's greater than the Kazais, you could be Mekel. And at the side of the pot, if it's smaller than the Kazais, you could be Mekel.
He's only saying the chumrah because it's a dairaisa?
Correct. Rabbi Yosef Amar, Tanoi shaklas me'alma. I don't understand. You're just like eliminating a Tana? Why can't you say there's a proper machlokes tanoim? How could you just ignore the Tanoim that are mekel? Tanoi, it's a machlokes tanoim. The Tanya we learned, hapasha ipsa, a bread that got spoiled. So it's chometz that's no longer edible for a person. Chayiv levar, you still have to destroy it. Because you can still use it as yeast. So it still has a status of chametz, therefore you must get rid of it. The only time you say that you need to get rid of chametz, that's only if it's still edible. What if you had a clump of sa'or that was hardened, and you decided you can use it as a bench, you can use it as a stool? Butler, that will be butler. So you clearly see with Amr Abshim ben Elazar, Batla, you have a big clump that's usable for a stool. It's surely a lot bigger than the kazayas, but since you were mevatel it from food and now you're using it as a stool, it's batal. So Mechlal, if that's what Abshim ben Elazar holds, Mechlal didn't have a kamasover. His bar plukta, the one who said Chayiv Levayr if they should real Sheikhel Kama Lachameboy Kama Isis Acheres, you see that suffer loy batla. He holds it wouldn't be batal. So you have here a machlokes, often a machlokes tanoim. If you could be mevatel a piece of chametz that's bigger than the kazayis, that's our shiloh too. At the bottom of the pot, if you have a piece of chametz that's bigger than the kazayis that you want to be mevatel because it's plugging a hole in the pot, can you be mevatel it? Alma kasover kol kazayis avagav de mevatel loy batel. You see the Tanakama holds that if it's a piece of chametz that's bigger than the kazayis, you cannot be mevatel it. And Abshim ben Elazar holds you could be mevatel it. So you have here often the machlokes tonight. Amalei Abaye, Zokta Abaye, you're very smart. Terasta bekazayis. You showed me, you illustrated to me clearly a machlokes between Abshim ben Elazar and the Tanakama about a piece of chametz that's greater than the kazayis, if you could be mevatel it or not. Great, but you forgot. We had two shilos here. The first shiloh was if it's at the bottom of the pot and it's greater than the kazayis, could you be mevatel it? And you covered us off that. You covered us off with that. But we also had a shiloh in the wall of the pot. If it's less than the kazayis, we had a machlokes between the two lashonis, whether or not you have to be mevayered or not. And there you haven't shown me two tanoim explicitly that are arguing about that. Pachas mikazayis mitaratza. Did you find me somebody? Did you find that open machlokes if it's less than the kazayis and it's at the wall of the pot that there's a machlokes whether or not you have to be mevatel? Therefore, Therefore, we're going to say that all of our two lashonis, the two brises, are both going according to Abshim ben Elazar, and there's no machlokes. So up until this point, we assumed that there's a machlokes by greater than the kazayis, and we thought there's a machlokes by less than the kazayis. Now the Gemara is changing it. There's no machlokes anymore. We all hold like Abshim ben Elazar. And first, I'm going to tell you outside what the Gemara is saying, and then we'll learn it inside. So what the Gemara is saying, there's actually three levels. At the bottom of the pot, everybody would agree that even if it's greater than the kazayis, it's bottled to the pot. Like Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar says, that you could be mevatel chametz even if it's greater than the kazayis. And I don't mean bittel. I mean, when you put it in the pot, we say it becomes part of the pot, and therefore it doesn't need beer. Everybody agrees with that. At the side of the pot, even though you don't need it to contain liquids, but the fact is you make lisha. You do need dough in this bowl, and therefore the walls of the pot are also somewhat relevant. Therefore, the walls of the pot, if it's b'makam lisha, if it's on the wall in low enough that you would still use that wall for kneading, so you would need that part of the wall for kneading. There will also say that it will be bottle if it's less than the kazayis. However, if it's higher up on the wall where you don't even use it when you're kneading because the dough doesn't come all the way up to the top of the bowl, the dough is usually not coming up to the top. There, it will be usher even less than the kazayis, and both brachos agree. So v'loy kasha ha b'makam lisha ha shaloi b'makam lisha. And Rashi takes us through how you would read the brachos, and you would read them very simply. So Zok Rashi over here as follows. V'hachikam or Tanakama. The Tanakama says, if it's at the bottom of the pot, that you need to contain liquids, even if the piece of dough was bigger than the kazayis, you would not be over by your. We say it's part of the bowl. The part of the bowl that's not holding water, meaning the sides, to go into fanais, the sides of the bowl, the mokam lishahu, you would have dough leaning up against the side when you're kneading, the lav mokam mayim, but normally you won't have water there. Choytzeitz v'over. If it was greater than the kazayis, then you would be over by your. You have to get rid of it. Upachas mikazayis, but if there was less than the kazayis of dough in the crack, I feel with the funnest nami in the chaytitz will also say it's bottled to the pot. The kiven the mahani porta lachazakisa. The fact is, the dough that's in the crevice at the side of the bowl does have an important impact because it acts as the wall. When you're kneading the dough, it pushes up against the wall of the pot. So it's actually an important part of the pot as well, although not as important as the bottom. Bottle will say a smaller piece of chametz, less than the kazayis, would be bottle. But all the way at the top of the pot, where dough will never be kneaded up there, going sofel yoina, the upper edge, loy ari ha tanamidi. The first Tana who said lakula wasn't even discussing that. What would the Tana have held in that case? All the way on top of the pot where you don't need it at all, you don't need to fill cracks there at all. There, even a smaller piece of dough than the kazayis, if it's in a crack, you have to make beer. The Tana Brasha Hachikamar, the second Tana, halachically holds exactly the same thing as the first Tana, but he's talking about a different part of the bowl. When he said Makam Asal Chazik, Isa, Kagoin de Fanois, Ene Chaitis, the Pachas Mekazais. He said that Makam Asal Chazik, he's referring to not the bottom of the barrel. When he was talking about Makam Asal Chazik, he was talking about the size of the barrel. And there he said, it's not Chaitis Pachas Mekazais. That's exactly what the first price said. And when he uses the words Makam She'ein Asal Chazik, he's not talking about the walls like the first Tyler was talking about. He's referring to the top of the top of the pot, which doesn't come into contact with dough at all. And the first price agrees with that as well. Everybody agrees that if there's a kazayis of dough in the walls, it's chaytitz. Everybody agrees that kazayis in the floor of the pot is not chaytitz. And everyone agrees that all the way on the top, if there's less than the kazayis, it's also chaytitz. So that's how the Gemara wants to say there's no more machlokes. Everybody agrees. Zok the Gemara. The question is when one Tana said b'makam shashel lechazik, he meant the floor, and the other Tana who said b'makam shashel lechazik, it's referring to the walls of makam lisha. Amar Vashi loitem shaloi b'makam lisha agaba the agna. Don't say that what's called shaloi b'makam lisha all the way to the top or even the lid, only that's called shaloi b'makam lisha, and only over there will chametz less than the kazayis be a problem. But maybe in the inner wall of the pot, all the way up to the top, that's considered makam lisha, and therefore only a kazayis will be a problem. Don't say that. El asif says the agna, even on the inner edge of the pot, all the way up to the top, is also considered loy b'makam lisha, and therefore even less than a kazayis of chametz will be a problem. Pekmar pshita, it's pashut. You don't do lisha all the way to the top of the pot. So what is the chiddush of Abashi? So sometimes when you're kneading, some dough moves up a little bit. When you're kneading, stuff moves around. It's possible that some dough will reach the top. So you might consider that the makam lisha, and therefore you're allowed to have up to a kazayis of chametz there. Kamash balon, that not only the parts of the wall of the pot that are normally used for lisha, only there you have up to a kazayis of allowance for a patch. But above that area, you're not even allowed to have a mashu of chametz. Amar Rab Nachman Amar Rav, halacha Rab Shimon ben Elazar. Halacha Rab Shimon ben Elazar that even a big piece of chametz you could be mevatel. Ain't is that so? The Amar Rab Yitzchak bar Ashi Amar Rav. So Rav we quoted a moment ago as passing like Rab Shimon ben Elazar. Yet here we're quoting Rav as saying im tach paneh batit batla. If you have a big piece of chametz, you can't just use it as a bench unless you actually smeared it, you coated it, you plated it with tit. If you plate it with tit, so then you're clearly showing that you want to use it for a bench. This is definitely no longer chametz. So you see that we don't pass like Reb Shimon ben Elazar that the chametz be'en you could be mevatel and use it for a bench. Zok to Gemara, ein chanami, tachin loy tachloi. Zok to Gemara, man de masniyah loy masniyah. It's a machlokes what Rav said. Did Rav Paskin like Reb Shimon ben Elazar, and you'd only talk with it, or did Rav Paskin not like Reb Shimon ben Elazar, and you didn't talk with it? Ikad Amri, Amar Reb Nachman Amar Rav, Ein halacha Reb Shimon ben Elazar. Reb Nachman said in the name of Rav that we're not passing like Reb Shimon ben Elazar. Amar Reb Yitzchak bar Ashi, Amar Rav, and talk whenever it bottle, but loy loy. So either it's a shiloh what Rav said, or Rav said beferish that he's not passing like Reb Shimon ben Elazar, and unless it was talk with it, you would not be able to use that as a bench. Amar Nachman Amar Shmuel, Shnei Chatzoy Zaysim. What if I had 2 half Zaysim filling crevices in a pot, the chutcha batzek b'neim, and there's a hair, there's a thread of dough that connects these 2 half kazayas. Is this a kazayas? And we're talking about in the wall of the pot, where if it's a kazayas, you'd have to be mavayri. Is it a kazayas or not? Zok to Gemara, roin kol shilu yinot lachut v'nitl nimoy chayv levayr. If I lift up that string of dough that's joining the 2 clumps, it pulls out the clumps. That means it's one big piece, and therefore it would be mechuyev in beer.
You know about a hairline fractures that would happen?
Well, there are 2 holes.
2 holes.
So you took a
and
piece
then
of dough, you
crack
pulled
it
them
in the
apart, and you stipped them into each hole, but there's still a little strand of dough joining the 2 clumps.
A crack that went along the bottom.
Lav dafka, that's right. Or maybe, yeah, I mean, it doesn't really matter. It's not,
No,
even
but
if it was filling a crack, it would still be a problem, because it's considered one big piece of dough. Yeah, even if it was filling a crack.
No, if it was filling her, for sure would be one piece, even if it's not filling a crack, and it just happens to be connected.
Okay. So the Gemara says, if they both all connect, then chayv l'vayr. I'm not ain't chayv l'vayr. Amar Ula, lo yamoran ela b'reva. This question that you need to have kazayis together, that's only in a pot. And if you don't have a kazayis, you don't have to do vatlik. Aval b'bayis, in your house, if you have 2 small pieces of chametz that are each less than a kazayis, chayiv levayr, avada, you have to be mevar that chametz. Why? My time, the zimnin the chanishlu, the nafal gabedoti. When you sweep, you might sweep them all together, and then it'll become a kazayis. So therefore, even less than the kazayis, you got to make sure to be mevar from your home. Amar boba marava. They had a shayla marava. What about the bayis faliyah? You had half a kazayis in the upstairs and half in the downstairs. Are you concerned that when you sweep, it might fall from the aliyah and land right on the lower level, and now you have the chametz together? Now, even if you're going to say that's too far-fetched, that those 2 pieces of chametz will ever come together, how about bayis v'achsadra, a house and its porch, where you could sweep them all together, and you might be able to make a half a kazayis of chametz on the achsadra, join the half a kazayis chametz in your bayis? Now, what if you hold that there it is a problem? What would be shnei batim zelef nemizeh? You had 2 individual houses. You had to go through one to get to the other. There, it's possible you might sweep them together, or maybe not. Now, Zakimor take you. What you see from here, I'll call upon him, is that you only have to make beer on a full kazayis of chametz, and the whole problem here is you might join them together. But on the half a kazayis of chametz, if it stays on its own, you wouldn't have to be invited, and that is the reason why when we put out the 10 pieces of bread, each piece alone is less than a kazayis. So if chas v'sholem we miss one, we don't have a kazayis of chametz there. But when we burn them, we're supposed to put them all together into one bag, because cumulatively they need to be a kazayis, because if not, we wouldn't be kind the mitzvah of tashbisu. Tanaraban, hapashi ipsa. What if you have bread that rotted out? A person can no longer eat it, but a dog can eat it. So the law is metama tumas oichlin b'kabetza. If it's a shir of a kabetza, it could be metama something else, meaning it still has a status of oichel. And the disrefes imatmei b'pesach. Erev Pesach. If you have a piece of chametz that nifsal ma'achilas kelef, and it's tamei, so we say it's still metama tumas oichlin. Yeah, it's still matama tumas. So let's say you have this bread that's rotten, and it's truma tahira. It's truma tahira. You're allowed to burn it with tuma when you're burning your chametz, even though you're being metama truma. And the reason why you're allowed to do it is like we discussed earlier. Anyway, in the Mishnah, in the Mishnah at the beginning of the Masechta, the Gemara tells us, this is at the beginning of Knead Kahanim, The Mishnah tells us that you're allowed to burn Truma Tahira, Truma Tameya on Erev Pesach. And even those who are Machmir, here you have already, it's Pasha Ibsha, so it's even better. The name of Nasan, they said, it would not be Tameh at all anymore. Once it's Nisal Me'achilas Adam, even though it's not Nisal Me'achilas Kelev, it's not going to be Matam anymore. Keman Azla Hadat Nan, who does the following Mishnah hold like? Klal Amr B'Tahiris, Kol HaMeyuchad Lo'ichel Adam Tameh Achi Yifsal Me'lechel Kelev. Here you have a Mishnah that says that until it's possible Me'achilas Kelev, it's still considered an Oichel. Command the Loik Reb Nosson, that would not be consistent with Reb Nosson, because Reb Nosson says that once it's Nifsal, Me'achilas Adam, it's no longer considered a Meichel. Zok the Gemara back to Tanarban. I ravis off Tan. They used to have, the people who made hides had big pots that they prepared their hides in, and it smelled awful. And they used flour as part of the process of processing the hides. So if it's Toich Shloisha Yomim, Chayav Levayer. Now there's no hides in there now. It's just a pot, but the pot itself reeks. If you put flour into the pot within 3 days of Pesach, we say you still have to be mevayer it because the flour that you put in is not spoiled enough in only 3 days, and therefore you still have to destroy it before Pesach. But if you put the flour into this pot more than 3 days ago, so it's sitting in there long enough that the flour now reeks, and it's also going to be not fit for consumption. You no longer have to destroy that chametz. This that we said that if it's within 3 days, you still have to destroy the chametz. If you put dough into the pot within 3 days of Pesach, that's only if you didn't put hide in. If you already put hide in this pot together with that flour, even within 3 days of Pesach, so the flour wasn't there very long, you still don't have to make beer, because once you put the hide in, it messes up the flour. You could never use it. It's not royu anymore la'achila, and therefore there's no chiyuv of beer chametz on it. If you put hides in and then you put flour in, even if it's there for a second, once the flour is there with the hide, it ruins the flour completely, and you would not have to make beer chametz anymore. I guess we could stop here. Oh, the bracket by David Dayan, right? Elul Nishma says, uncle, Jimmy Dayan, you remember what his name was? Is it Chaim Ben David? There's enough rum there, I think. Let's see if we could find it. In the thing you can send me. It is. It's Chaim Ben David. You're right. It's Chaim Ben David, who was nifter last week, and the neshama should have an aliyah. Okay, everybody have a wonderful, wonderful day.
Yeah,
And wear your mask.
literally.